Every single second of the day, your body is performing this incredible, invisible, high-stakes chemical balancing act, all just to keep you alive. It's this precise science of fluids and electrolytes, and when that balance gets thrown off, well, that's when medicine steps in with some pretty fascinating math to set things right. So, here's what we're going to cover in this explainer. First, we'll look at your body's daily needs, the baseline. Then we'll explore what happens when that balance is lost. And finally, we're going to break down the actual medical formulas used to fix three really critical imbalances involving acidosis, potassium, and sodium. Okay, so first up, your body's daily needs. See, before we can even begin to understand what goes wrong, we've got to know what right even looks like. What does our internal chemistry actually require just to function properly every single day? And it all really starts with water. The basic rule of thumb for adults is a daily intake of about 30 to 40 milliliters for every single kilogram of body weight. This is the absolute foundation that all the other balances are built on. So, what does that actually look like in the real world? Well, for a person who weighs 70 kilograms, that's about 154 pounds, the math works out to a daily requirement of 2,450 milliliters. That's almost 2.5 liters. That's your starting point for a normal day. But here's the thing, that baseline is anything but static. Life happens, right? A fever over 38 degrees Celsius, that's about 104.4 Fahrenheit, can demand an extra 300 to 500 milliliters of fluid. And as you can see, things like rapid breathing or being on a ventilator also crank up the body's water needs. It's a seriously dynamic system. And beyond water, we've got our super important electrolytes. For adults, the daily need for both potassium and sodium is pretty much the same, about 1 millimole per kilogram of body weight. But for kids, it's a totally different ballgame. During those fast growth spurts, infants might need 2, even 3 times more potassium than an adult on a per kilogram basis. All right, so that's the baseline for staying healthy. But what happens when things go sideways? That brings us right into our second section, when the balance is lost. And this is where we shift gears from just daily maintenance to some real critical care science. We're going to zero in on 3 key imbalances. First up is metabolic acidosis, which is basically when you have a shortage of bicarbonate in your blood, making it way too acidic. Then there's hypokalemia, which is a dangerous drop in your potassium levels. And third, hyponatremia, when your sodium levels get critically low. So the big question is, how do you fix this? How do medical pros carefully and methodically bring the body's chemistry back from the edge? Well, it is definitely not guesswork. It all comes down to some incredibly precise and absolutely vital mathematics. Let's dive into that math, starting with our first formula in section 3, the acidosis correction formula. This whole thing is about restoring the body's super delicate pH balance when it swings into the danger zone of being too acidic. So just to be super clear, metabolic acidosis is what happens when your blood pH drops specifically because of a bicarbonate deficit. You can think of bicarbonate as a kind of buffer, a shock absorber that keeps our blood from getting too acidic. When you're running low on it, you've got a major problem. Okay, so here's exactly how they calculate that deficit. First, you take the patient's weight in kilograms. You multiply that by 0.3, which is a number that represents the volume where bicarbonate hangs out in the body. Then, you figure out the gap between the target bicarbonate level, which is 24, and what the patient's level actually is. You multiply those two results together, and boom, you have the exact deficit that needs to be replaced. Now, listen up, because this is incredibly important. The source material makes it crystal clear these kinds of corrections are not something you can just eyeball or estimate. They absolutely must be done under a doctor's direct supervision with constant lab monitoring. The stakes are just way too high to do it any other way. All right, next up, we're going to apply that same kind of precise logic to restoring potassium levels when they get too low. This condition is called hypokalemia. So hypokalemia gets diagnosed when blood potassium levels dip below 3.5 millimoles per liter. And this is a huge deal because potassium is essentially the electricity that helps run your nerves and your heart rhythm. Too little of it can be genuinely life-threatening. The calculation here, you'll see, follows a pretty similar logic. You find the gap between the target potassium level, which is usually around 4.0, and the patient's actual level. You multiply that gap by their body weight, and then by a distribution volume of 0.4. The number you get is the total potassium deficit, in millimoles, that needs to be administered very carefully. And that word carefully is doing a lot of work there because you absolutely cannot rush potassium replacement. The intravenous infusion has to be slow. We're talking no more than 10 to 20 millimoles per hour. Why? Because going too fast can cause severe, even fatal heart problems. It's a perfect example of how the cure can be just as dangerous as the problem if it's not handled with absolute precision. And on to our final formula in Section 5, fixing sodium deficiency. This is the math behind correcting that condition we mentioned, hyponatremia. So hyponatremia happens when your sodium levels fall below 136 millimoles per liter. Sodium is the main driver of water balance in our bodies. So when it's low, it can cause our cells, and this includes our brain cells, to swell up with way too much water. The calculation to fix this follows a pattern you'll probably recognize by now. First, you find the gap between the target sodium level of 135 and the patient's actual level. Then, you multiply that gap by their body weight, and finally by 0.6, which represents the total body water. And that gives you the precise amount of sodium needed to get things back in balance. But just like with potassium, speed is your absolute enemy here. Correcting sodium levels too quickly is extremely dangerous. It can lead to this devastating neurological condition called osmotic demyelination syndrome. And that's exactly why the correction rate has to be painstakingly slow, not going up by more than 8 to 12 millimoles per liter over a full 24-hour period. So, when you step back and look at it all, it's pretty incredible. We've gone from something as simple as drinking a glass of water to meet your daily needs, all the way to these complex, high-stakes, intravenous calculations. Maintaining the body's delicate equilibrium is truly a science of precision. You know, our bodies really are these masterful chemists, constantly working, constantly fine-tuning and recalibrating to maintain that perfect balance. Seeing the intense, precise math required to fix things when they go wrong really makes you think, what does this teach us about the incredibly fine line we all walk every single day between health and crisis?